1 in 5 Americans think violence could be necessary to reach their political objectives in 2024. That's according to a new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll. That may only be a little more than 20% of Americans, but it's still an alarming number. However, research varies on this topic, with other polls showing lower numbers. Here's what some of you across the country had to say about political violence and the way this country has become so divided.
It's a disaster and a nightmare. There's too much acrimony and the sides are too polarized.
It's sad. It's ugly. It's scary.
I am concerned about violence following the election.
We see already the violence that had happened in the past, so I could definitely see it happening again with this election.
I think January 6th was a shock for all of us, and we shouldn't be shocked anymore.
I think it could be worse than that. Something broader than January 6th. It could be around the country even.
I pray for our country. I pray for unity. I don't know if it's possible. I have faith and hope, but man, it's dwindling, but I still believe in this country.
Joining us now is Princeton University Political Scientist, Dr. Lauren Wright. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. You know, the fact that more than 20% of Americans believe violence may be the answer when it comes to the upcoming elections is quite alarming, but does that surprise you?
It does. The best possible research I know about this comes from my colleague at Dartmouth, Sean Westwood, who leads the Polarization Research Lab. And what they find is that these surveys showing vast support for partisan violence are actually really severely overstated. And part of that just comes from replicating the surveys. They asked over 100,000 people what they thought about this. And once you ask the question a different way and exclude people who speed through the survey, it's actually much closer to 4%, even 3% among Democrats and Republicans. So I don't see that kind of disheartening evidence in the data myself.
Right. And in this survey of those polled, and there were, 28% said they believed violence was the answer. 28% were Republican, only 12% were Democratic, and 18% were independent. So from what I'm gathering, those numbers don't really seem consistent with what you've heard.
They don't. And I actually don't think there's big partisan differences in this one way or the other. I'll go back to the overall picture in a second, but the same research I just mentioned asks about specific acts, like, for instance, the most extreme one, partisan motivated murder. Do you support that? And it actually finds about 2% of Democrats say yes and 1% of Republicans say yes. So there's certain areas where Democrats seem to have more propensity for this than Republicans and vice versa. But again, we're really splitting hairs here. It's a fringe, a very small sliver of the American population. Most people don't support this in any way, shape, or form, and that, I think, should be encouraging to people.
The January 6th attack shocked the nation, but as a political scientist, Did you see that coming when you look back at politics in this country and the way they've unfolded in recent years?
I don't think anyone who's being really honest completely saw it coming. I mean, It was an event that we haven't seen in over 100 years in our country, anything like it in our history, really. And, I think that Trump's ability to motivate his supporters to commit violence, in some cases, to be very disruptive at the least, and to do real damage at the most, and put people's lives at risk, I think is very, very concerning. And, some of my colleagues who study media and politics might have said, if you looked at the online chatter activity, if you looked at how angry people are at each other and Trump's ability to rile those people up, you wouldn't have been surprised. But I am still surprised because I study political communication. I teach a graduate class on that. And, Julia, a lot of people in this country don't even vote. And so expecting that they'll somehow take up arms against their neighbors on a large scale, especially now after January 6th, I don't think we'll see anything close again. And yes, I was very surprised when it happened and very, very upset.
Yeah, it was certainly a very upsetting, remarkable event. And during that day, we saw lawmakers and public officials' safety threatened, including, every member of Congress that was there, Vice President Mike Pence, then Vice President. But before that, we saw Congressman Steve Scalise and Senator Rand Paul. They were victims of political violence. How concerned are you for the safety of lawmakers going forward?
Well, I do think at any time in American history, lawmakers have received attention, an outsized amount. But now I do think they're targeted and publicized in a way they haven't been just because of the media environment. And so we're seeing more security precautions, which are absolutely appropriate. And I think if there's any silver lining to January 6th, it's that, again, Capitol Police, different intelligence organizations, different government offices are ready that this is at least somewhat of a possibility, and they've now put more resources and attention behind this. So I think it's appropriate.
We know that former President Trump was, his name, he was very much connected and, some would say played a central role in January
Absolutely.
6th. I know there's back and forth on that. But I mean, look, we're seeing him run for president again. And at the same time, he's facing these 4 criminal trials. He's on trial in New York as we speak. Are you concerned about the potential for political violence surrounding his criminal trials?
I think that's really good context, and you stated it so clearly and so fairly and responsibly, Julia. On the one hand, I think that Trump is inextricable from January 6th in many ways. But on the other hand, a lot of people aren't paying attention to Trump, his trials, and any sort of potential for violence, any sort of, disturbing activity that could come from it. And so let me say that a little bit more in a more digestible way. Most Americans, when they wake up and they think about the election, if they even do at this point, they think of day-to-day concerns. They think of prices, they think of wages, they think of how am I going to pay for my kids' health care and all these bills that I face every day. And Trump, his trials and the potential upset that might come of it actually is really low on their list of priorities. And so while we should recognize the potential for these things to go awry, and anytime there's a protest, they can, I also think it's incumbent on both parties and all analysts to look at this through a realistic lens and to think about how most Americans aren't paying that much attention.
Yeah, and polling would certainly back that up, that, the economy is once again their top concerns when it comes to voters. But, another top story this week are the college protests that we've seen on the campuses of Columbia, Yale, and NYU, and more campuses. More than 100 pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested across those campuses, including at, those schools I just mentioned. The protests shuttered campuses. Columbia canceled in-person classes, and the gates to Harvard Yard were closed to the public. How do you see the Israeli-Gaza war impacting political violence, not just on these campuses, but really across the country?
Well, I think it's twofold. One, when most people look at these protests, they see absolute chaos, and they know most of these kids aren't Trump voters, and many are not Republicans. And that's just a fact that this is fringe, but nonetheless activity from left-leaning groups and left-leaning students, progressive students. And so I think really hurts Democrats in a year that they have a lot of advantages heading into the election, including issues like abortion and just non-chaos of a potential Donald Trump run or White House occupancy. And, we have the same concerns at Princeton. One of my former students, Abigail Anthony, who now works at the National Review, just broke the story this morning that Princeton's pro-Palestine students are considering a similar encampment. We've been assured that they are not allowed to do this and that it's very disruptive. So frankly, it's much closer to home for me, and I'm waiting to see what will happen.
Yeah, I think it's going to be close to home for a lot of people on or connected to college campuses. I want to go to a recent poll from the Associated Press and the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research that found that the majority of Americans still share the same core values. 9 out of 10 U.S. adults said they feel the right to vote, the right to equal protection under the law, and the right to privacy are extremely or very important. Lauren, how is it possible for a nation to share these core values but at the same time remain so deeply divided?
I think a lot of it is how the news is framed. And I'm so glad you ended up on this optimistic note, because it's true. Americans do share a lot of values, and we see that across a range of policies too. You know, when we ask people, do you want better healthcare? Do you want teachers to get paid more? Do you want to secure Social Security for the future? Do you support Medicare expansion? Most Americans say yes. It's just on the details. How do we pay for this? Who should pay for this? Where you see opinions start to split up. And so, yes, Americans still share core values. Most Americans are moderate, even though they lean one way or the other. You know, they tend to identify more with patriotic values than they do with criticism of the country. And so, yes, on these big things, Americans are in step, and it's important to remember.
And that same poll also found that 84% of Americans say they feel the same way about freedom of religion. Yet at the same time, like I said, we continue to see so much hate in this country. I mean, can you speak to that on the religious note?
Sure. And it really relates to a question you asked earlier about the potential for political violence. You know, most support for partisan political violence actually doesn't come from older people. It comes from highly educated younger people. And it's from this same group, I think, of younger voters who are encamping on college campuses, who are leading pro-Palestine protests. And there is a lack of tolerance there for pro-Israel students. That's just been quite blatant, and it's very disappointing. But I do think it's among highly educated young elites, and it doesn't describe different sectors of the voting population.
You know, just to wrap here, Lauren, we're in the middle of a really tumultuous election cycle with two very polarizing candidates. Is there any hope in sight for unity?
I think so. You know, we only have two choices in this country. We have RFK Jr., of course, too, this year. But we have a, simple majority, single ballot system. And we're probably never going to elect a third party candidate. So a lot of the strife we see is not that people absolutely love Joe Biden and absolutely love Donald Trump. A lot of voters are just looking and they're choosing what they see as the lesser of two evils. And so that really underlines this theme of more unity than division. But when you have to make a choice, people do pick their sides and fight very hard.
That's a really good optimistic note to end on, and some very important context.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I really appreciate it. Dr. Lauren Wright, thank you so much.
Thanks, Julia.
Criminal conspiracy, catch and kill, and attempts to influence the 2016 election. The fiery opening arguments from prosecutors in Trump's historical hush money case. While the former president is facing 34 felony counts in a New York courtroom, Trump continues to attack courts across the country and pinning the charges on attempts to stop his presidential run.
This is really a concerted witch hunt. Very simple. Everything you heard in there, this is a witch hunt by numerous judges, Democrat judges. You take a look at it, Engoron is a whack job. What he did was a disgrace.
Could a conviction sway Republicans away from backing Trump? And is the trial already having an effect on registered voters? It's time to go on the record with Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, as always, it's great to see you this week. You know, I want to draw our attention to a new Marist national poll that has President Biden leading Trump 51 to 48%. Are we finally seeing a national swing in Biden's favor, or is this just another stop on the roller coaster?
Yeah, we're seeing that. And if you look at the Hill DDHQ average, we see Biden and Trump, Biden basically closing the gap and taking him going ahead for a little while last week. This NBC Marist poll you have here is also a pretty good indication of it. My favorite stat out of that poll, by the way, of the voters who did not vote in 2020 and 2022, 63% support Donald Trump. So that's an interesting stat going into the fall if we see a high turnout.
Sticking with the news of the week, we know that Trump's criminal trial in New York, one of them, is underway. Is there any recent polling showing that this court case, or any of his court cases really, are dividing his base?
No, it's his base is sticking with him. Now, the court cases, were day 3. Opening arguments were yesterday. The jury selection was last week. Trump has been very good about giving some pretty pointed statements that make the news media after this. So we've got a little ways to go. But right now, the polling, his base is holding strong with him.
Yeah, and for context to our viewers, this trial, the hush money trial, is expected to wrap up before Election Day, so that'll be an interesting update. Trump's plans to prop up RFK Jr. might backfire. Another new Marist national poll has Biden in the lead in a 3-way race with RFK Jr. Scott, we see it constantly goes back and forth. Who does RFK Jr. hurt more? But does this poll show that Democrats can maybe breathe a sigh of relief for now?
It's certainly a good data point. Julie, you and I have been talking about this for a couple months now with RFK Jr. The polling has shown that, RFK Jr. takes away from Joe Biden. But in the focus groups, once these voters get to understand the RFK Jr. positions, they appear to switch over to Donald Trump. And I think we're starting to see that as more and more comes out of RFK Jr. I think it's going to even out a little bit, but this poll is one data point. I think we're going to see some more that RFK is taking a little bit more from Trump than Biden. At least that's where it's trending.
Speaking of data points, going back 4 years, at this point in the 2020 election, Biden, then candidate Biden, was leading 5.8%, but only won by 4.5%. Looking at recent historical trends, is there anything we can predict here, or is it still too early?
It's still too early. I do like talking about that, though, right? We like to look at some of these early polls and these trends 6-7 months out to see if there's any indication going forward. But here's what I will predict. I think we're going to see a lot of lead changes in terms of who's ahead nationally. I think we're going to see a lot of these battleground states like the Michigans, Wisconsins, Pennsylvania. 1 week Trump's going to be up. The next week Biden's going to be up. So, basically I predict volatility. And I think that's what some of this polling shows, is that either of these candidates is going to look good 1 week or the other. It just matters what they look like that first week in November.
Moving on to issues, one of the biggest concerns for Americans is immigration and border security. Trump stepped into House negotiations and killed any deal that would have made it to President Biden's desk. Will this ultimately be a boost for Democrats?
Look, he would like it to be. They want the issue, and the Democrats are certainly trying to remind those independent and potentially swayable Republican voters that they had a deal on the table, and the Republicans decided not to take it. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, voters have short memories, and they're pretty polarized on this. They're going to take Trump's campaign word for it and say, hey, look, we're going to wait for Trump to get a better deal, and we didn't miss out on anything last time.
There's been a lot of reporting on the GOP infighting in the House particular and, in the future of Speaker Mike Johnson's job. But this infighting seems to have boiled over to a point of no return, even in the Senate, as Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, publicly battles it out with Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio. Is there any chance for Republicans to make amends, or do you think this will ultimately play out until Trump wins or loses this election?
I think it's going to play out till he wins and loses. And let's look at two things. This is not the first senator, fellow Republican senator that Mitch McConnell's gotten a fight with. There was Rick Scott still going on, but there was a leadership challenge in the last couple of years. Senator McConnell says he's stepping down from leadership after this year. This is his time to really kind of say what he feels on his way out. I don't see these tensions simmering at all. And I even think, if Donald Trump loses, I think you could still see a split in the Republican conference there between some of the older, more establishment and some of the newer like J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley who want to see the conference go a different direction.
That'll be interesting to see it play out in the Senate because we talk about the House so much in terms of that infighting. Back to presidential, RFK Jr. recently qualified for the Michigan ballot. What other states is the third-party candidate looking to qualify in next?
Well, so we just put up a new tracker for the Hill. If you go to thehill.com, you'll be able to see it there. And we're tracking where RFK is collecting the signatures. Now, there's a few states out there that he can collect them in, but not necessarily report. There's a few states out there where he can't necessarily, we don't know exactly what the requirements are, but it appears he's got the signatures in places like Arizona, Georgia. I expect him to make the threshold in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him on the ballot in 20 to 25 states by the time we get to this November, notably not 50, but certainly in some states that, per our earlier segment, he's going to have an impact in.
Yeah, definitely some states to watch. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you for helping us break it down. Thanks for having me. Which party will RFK Jr. take more votes from? Here now with a deeper dive into RFK's third-party run is the Hill staff writer Rafael Bernal.
Democrats are scared of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s name, and Republicans are scared of his appeal to libertarians. And with good reason. Neither party expects RFK to win or even to pick up a state, but he will draw away some voters from President Biden and former President Trump. So the story of RFK in the 2024 election is not about what he believes or what he proposes, but about electoral math. The question is, can Kennedy siphon off enough voters in any state to change the results? And will that state swing the whole election? To find out if it can happen, let's see if it has happened before. Let's start with the one race that pitted a sitting president, a former president, and a third candidate against each other, just because that sounds familiar. In 1912, former President Teddy Roosevelt, a progressive Republican, decided he didn't like how President William Howard Taft, a Republican who had turned increasingly conservative, was running the country. So Teddy ran as a Republican, he didn't get the nomination, and he set up his own party to challenge Taft. And Roosevelt did beat Taft in the general election, but by more than 1 million votes. But Democrat Woodrow Wilson, he wiped the floor with both of them, taking 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88 and Taft's 8. But that's where it gets interesting. Wilson had 6.3 million votes. Combined, Roosevelt and Taft had 7.6 million. Did they split the Republican vote? Yes. Is that the only reason Wilson won? Probably not. Fast forward to 1992, when Ross Perot jumped in to challenge President George H.W. Bush, who had reneged on his promise not to raise taxes. The young upstart from Arkansas, then Governor Bill Clinton, got the Democratic nomination in June, and the three-way race was on. Except Perot dropped out and came back only when Clinton was already leading, so it's hard to make the case for a spoiler there. The same at a much smaller scale is true of the Green Party candidate Jill Stein's effect on the 2016 race. She likely took more votes from Clinton than from Trump, but Libertarian Gary Johnson did better than Stein all over the country. We skipped the one almost certain spoiler. The year 2000 presidential election came down to one state, Florida. Former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Al Gore basically tied with 2.9 million votes each, and Bush took the state by 537 votes after intense legal wrangling. Consumer rights crusader Ralph Nader came in third in Florida, a distant third with 97,000 votes. It's almost certain a broad majority of those votes would have gone to Gore. Many Democrats complained, including RFK Jr., who at the time called Nader irresponsible for equating Bush and Gore. So, if it comes down to one state in November, and it very well could, RFK votes could easily outnumber the split between Trump and Biden voters. But if RFK is attracting Democrats who like his name and Republicans who like his proposals, who is he spoiling the election for?
That's it for What's America Thinking. Come back next week. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And we want to hear from you. Leave your comments and let us know what's on your mind.